Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit, the Ethical Order, Ethical Action, Human and Divine Knowledge, Guilt, and Destiny. The way in which the antithesis is constituted in this ethical realm is such that self-consciousness has not yet received its due as a particular individuality. There it has the value, on the one hand, merely of the universal will, and on the other of consanguinity. This particular individual counts only as a shadowy unreality. As yet no deed has been committed, but the deed is the actual self. It disturbs the peaceful organisation and movement of the ethical world. What there appears as order and harmony of its two essences, each of which authenticates and completes the other, becomes through the deed a transition of opposites in which each proves itself to be the non-reality rather than the authentication of itself and the other. It becomes the negative movement, or the eternal necessity, of a dreadful fate, which engulfs in the abyss of its single nature divine and human law alike, as well as the two self-consciousnesses, in which these powers have their existence, and for us passes over into the absolute being for self of the purely individual self-consciousness. The ground from which this movement starts and on which it takes place is the ethical realm. What is active in this movement, however, is self-consciousness qua ethical consciousness. It is the simple, pure direction of activity towards the essentiality of ethical life, that is, duty. In it there is no caprice and equally no struggle, no indecision, since the making and testing of law has been given up. On the contrary, the essence of ethical life is for this consciousness immediate, unwavering, without contradiction. Consequently, we are not faced with the sorry spectacle of a collision between passion and duty, nor with the cosmic spectacle of a collision between duty and duty, a collision which, as regards its content, is the same as that between passion and duty. For passion is equally capable of being seen as a duty, because when consciousness separates itself from its immediate substantial essence and withdraws into itself, it becomes the merely formal universal into which one content as well as another fits equally well, as we found out before. But the collision of duties is comic, because it expresses a contradiction, namely the contradiction of an absolute that is opposed to itself, an absolute and then the nothingness of this so-called absolute or duty. The ethical consciousness, however, knows what it has to do and has already decided whether to belong to the divine or the human law. This immediate firmness of decision is something implicit and therefore has at the same time the significance of a natural being, as we have seen. Nature, not the accident of circumstances or choice, assigns one sex to one law, the other to the other law, or conversely, the two ethical powers themselves give themselves an individual existence and actualize themselves in the two sexes. Now, because on the one hand, the ethical order essentially consists in this immediate firmness of decision, and for that reason there is for consciousness essentially only one law, while on the other hand, the ethical powers are real and effective in the self of consciousness, these powers acquire the significance of excluding and opposing one another. In self-consciousness, they exist explicitly, whereas in the ethical order, they are only implicit. The ethical consciousness, because it is decisively for one of the two powers, is essentially character. It does not accept that both have the same essential nature. For this reason, the opposition between them appears as an unfortunate collision of duty, merely with a reality which possesses no right of its own. The ethical consciousness is, qua self-consciousness, in this opposition, and as such it at once proceeds to force into subjection to the law which it accepts, the reality which is opposed to it, or else to outwit it. Since it sees right only on one side and wrong on the other, that consciousness which belongs to the divine law sees in the other side only the violence of human caprice, whilst that which holds to human law sees in the other only the self-will and disobedience of the individual who insists on being his own authority. For the commands of government have a universal public meaning open to the light of day. The will of the other law, however, is locked up in the darkness of the nether regions, and in its outer existence manifests as the will of an isolated individual which, as contradicting the first, is a wanton outrage. In this way there arises in consciousness the antithesis of the known and the unknown, just as in substance there was an antithesis of the conscious and the unconscious, and the absolute right of ethical self-consciousness comes into conflict with the divine right of essential being. For self-consciousness qua consciousness, the world of objective reality as such has an essential being, but according to its substance it is the unity of itself and its opposite, and ethical self-consciousness is the consciousness of that substance. Therefore, the object in its opposition to the subject has lost entirely the significance of having an essential being of its own, but just as those spheres, in which it is only a thing, have long since vanished, so too have these spheres, in which consciousness gives a fixed existence to something from out of itself, and converts an isolated moment into essence. Against such one-sidedness, the actual world has a power of its own. It stands leagued with truth against consciousness, and itself shows the latter what truth is. The ethical consciousness, however, has drunk from the cup of substance, and has forgotten all the one-sidedness of being for self, of its ends and peculiar notions, and has therefore at the same time drowned in the Stygian water all essentiality of its own, and all independence of the objective actual world. Its absolute right is therefore that when it acts in accordance with ethical law, it shall find in this actualization nothing else but the fulfilment of this law itself, and the deed shall manifest only ethical action. What is ethical, being at once absolute essence and absolute power, cannot suffer any perversion of the content. If it were only absolute essence without power, it could suffer perversions by the individuality, but this, as an ethical consciousness, when it gives up its one-sided being for self, renounced its right to pervert the content, just as conversely, mere power would be perverted by essence, if it were a one-sided being for self. On account of this unity, the individuality is the pure form of substance, which is the content, and the action is the transition from thought to actuality, merely as the movement of an insubstantial antithesis, whose moments have no particular distinctive content and no essentiality of their own. Consequently, the absolute right of the ethical consciousness is that the deed, the shape in which it actualizes itself, shall be nothing else but what it knows. But the ethical essence has split itself into two laws, and consciousness as an undivided attitude towards law is assigned only to one, just as the simple unitary consciousness insists as its absolute right that the essence has appeared to it, qua ethical, as the essence is in itself, so too the essence insists on the right belonging to its reality or on its own right to be a twofold essence. But at the same time, this right of the essence does not stand over against its self-consciousness, as if the essence existed somewhere else. On the contrary, it is self-consciousness's own essence. It has its existence and its power in self-consciousness alone, and its antithesis is the act of self-consciousness itself. For this latter, just because it is a self to itself and advances to action, raises itself out of simple immediacy and spontaneously splits itself into two. By this act, it gives up the specific quality of the ethical life, of being the simple certainty of immediate truth, and initiates the division of itself into itself as the active principle and into the reality over against it, a reality which, for it, is negative. By the deed, therefore, it becomes guilt, for the deed is its own doing, and doing is its inmost nature. And the guilt also acquires the meaning of crime, for as a simple ethical consciousness, it has turned towards one law but turned its back on the other, and violates the latter by its deed, guilt is not an indifferent, ambiguous affair, as if the deed is actually seen in the light of the day could, or perhaps could not, be the action of the self, as if with the doing of it there could be linked something external and accidental that did not belong to it, from which aspect, therefore, the action would be innocent. On the contrary, the action is itself this splitting into two, this explicit self-affirmation, and the establishing over against itself of an alien external reality. That there is such a reality, this stems from the action itself, and results from it. Innocence, therefore, is merely non-action. Like the mere being of a stone, not even that of a child. As regards content, however, the ethical action contains the moment of crime, because it does not do away with the natural occasion of the two laws to the two sexes, but rather being an undivided attitude towards the law, remains within the sphere of natural immediacy, and qua action turns this one-sidedness into guilt by seizing on only one side of the essence and adopting a negative attitude towards the other, that is, violating it. The place in the universal ethical life of guilt and crime, of deeds and actions, will find more definite expression later, but this much is immediately evident, that it is not this particular individual who acts and is guilty, for as this self he is only the unreal shadow, or he exists merely as a universal self, and individuality is purely the formal moment of the action as such, the content being the laws and customs which for the individual are those of his class and station. He is the substance qua genus, which by its determinateness becomes indeed a species, although the species remains at the same time the universal of the genus. Self-consciousness within the nation descends from the universal only as far down as mere particularity, and not down to the single individuality, which posits an exclusive self, an actual existence, which in its action is negative towards itself. On the contrary, its action rests on secure confidence in the whole, unmixed with any alien element, neither with fear nor hostility. Ethical self-consciousness now learns from its deed the developed nature of what it actually did, as much when it obeyed divine law as when it followed human law. The law that is manifest to it is linked in the essence with its opposite. The essence is the unity of both, but the deed has only carried out one law in contrast to the other. But the two laws being linked in the essence, the fulfilment of the one evokes the other, and the deed, having made it so, calls it forth as a violated and now hostile entity, demanding revenge. In the action, only one aspect of the resolve as such is clearly manifest. The resolve, however, is in itself the negative aspect, which confronts the resolve with another, with something alien to the resolve which knows what it does. Actuality, therefore, holds concealed within it the other aspect, which is alien to this knowledge, and does not reveal the whole truth about itself to consciousness. The son does not recognize his father in the man who has wronged him, and whom he slays, nor his mother in the queen whom he makes his wife. In this way, a power which shuns the light of day ensnares the ethical self-consciousness, a power which breaks forth only after the deed is done, and seizes the doer in the act, for the accomplished deed is the removal of the antithesis between the knowing self and the actuality confronting it. The doer cannot deny the crime or his guilt. The significance of the deed is that what was unmoved has been set in motion, and that what was locked up in mere possibility has been brought out into the open. Hence, to link together the unconscious and the conscious, non-being with being, in this truth, therefore, the deed is brought out into the light of day as something in which the conscious is bound up with the unconscious, what is one's own with what is alien to it, as an entity divided within itself, whose other aspect consciousness experiences and also finds to be its own, but as the power it has of violated and roused to hostility. It can be that the right which lay in wait is not present in its own proper shape to the consciousness of the doer, but is present only implicitly in the inner guilt of the resolve and the action. But the ethical consciousness is more complete, its guilt more inexcusable. if it knows beforehand the law and the power which it opposes, if it takes them to be violence and wrong, to be ethical merely by accident, and like Antigone, knowingly commits the crime, the accomplished deed completely alters in point of view the very performance of it, declares that what is ethical must be actual, for the realization of the purpose is the purpose of the action. Doing directly expresses the unity of actuality and substance. It declares that actuality is not an accident of essence, but that in union with essence it is not granted to say to any right that it is not a true right. The ethical consciousness must, on account of this actuality and on account of its deed, acknowledge its opposite as its own actuality, must acknowledge its guilt. Because we suffer, we acknowledge we have erred. That is a quote from Antigone. With this acknowledgement, there is no longer any conflict between ethical purpose and actuality. It signifies the return to an ethical frame of mind, which knows that nothing counts but right. But the doer thereby surrenders his own character and the reality of his self, and has been ruined. His being consists in his belonging to his ethical law, as his substance in acknowledging the opposite law. The other ceases to be for him his substance, and instead of attaining actuality, it has become an unreality, a sentiment or disposition. The substance disappears, it is true, in the individuality as his pathos, and the individuality appears as that which animates the substance and hence stands above it. But the substance is a pathos that is at the same time his character. The ethical individuality is directly and intrinsically one with this, his universal aspect, exists in it alone, and is incapable of surviving the destruction of the ethical power by its opposite. But at the same time, this individuality has a certainty that that individuality, whose pathos is the opposing power, suffers no more injury than it has inflicted. The movement of the ethical powers against each other and of the individualities, calling them into life and action, have attained their true end only insofar as both sides suffer the same destruction, for neither power has any advantage over the other that would make it a more essential moment of the substance. The equal essentiality of both and their indifferent existence alongside each other means that they are without a self. In the dead they exist as beings with a self, but with a diverse self, and this contradicts the unity of the self and constitutes their unrighteousness and necessary destruction. Character, likewise, in respect of its pathos or a substance, in part belongs to one only. In part, from the aspect of knowing, the one character, like the other, is split into a conscious and an unconscious part, and since each itself calls forth this opposition, and its not knowing is through the deed its own affair, each is responsible for the guilt which destroys it. The victory of one power and its character, and the defeat of the other, would thus be only the part and the incomplete work which irresistibly advances to the equilibrium of the two. Only in the downfall of both sides alike is absolute right accomplished, and the ethical substance as the negative power which engulfs both sides, that is, omnipotent and righteous destiny, steps on the scene. If both powers are taken according to their specific content and its individualization, we are presented with a picture of the conflict between them in their individual forms. On its formal side, it is the conflict of the ethical order and self-consciousness with unconscious nature and the contingency stemming from nature. The latter has a right against the former because this is only true spirit, is only in an immediate unity with its substance. On the side of content, it is the clash between divine and human law. The youth comes away from the unconscious spirit of the family and becomes the individuality of the community, but that he still belongs to the nature from which he wrenched himself free is evidenced by the fact that he emerges in the contingent form of two brothers, each of whom with equal right takes possession of the community the inequality of the earlier and later birth, and inequality which is the natural difference, has no importance for them when they enter the ethical life of the community. But the government, as the unitary soul of the self, of the national spirit, does not tolerate a duality of individuality, and the ethical necessity of this unity is confronted by the natural accident of there being more than one. These two brothers, therefore, fall into dispute, and their equal right to the power of the state destroys them both, for they were equally wrong. Looked at from the human point of view, the one who has committed the crime is the one who, not being in actual possession, attacks the community at the head of which the other stood, while on the other hand he has the right on his side, who knew how to apprehend the other merely as an isolated individual detached from the community, and taken advantage of his powerlessness, banished him. He has struck only at the individual as such, not the community, not at the essence of human right. The community attacked and defended by what is merely particular, and so without substantial content, preserves itself, and the brothers bring about their own destruction through their reciprocal action. For individuality, which for the sake of its being for self, puts the whole in peril, I should say, has expelled itself from the community and is the source of its own destruction. The community, however, will honour the one who was found on its side, but the government, the restored unity self of the community, will punish him who already proclaimed its devastation on the walls of the city by depriving him of the last honour. He who wantonly attacked the spirit's highest form of consciousness, the spirit of the community, must be stripped of the honour of his entire and finished being, the honour due to the spirit of the departed. But if the universal thus easily knocks off the very tip of the pyramid, and indeed carries off the victory over the rebellious, a principle of pure individuality, namely the family, it has thereby merely entered on a conflict with the divine law, a conflict of self-conscious spirit with what is unconscious, for the latter is the other essential power, and is therefore not destroyed, but merely wronged by the conscious spirit. But it has only the bloodless shade to help it in actually carrying out its law, the face of the power and authority of that other, publicly manifest law. Being the law of weakness and darkness, it therefore at first succumbs to the powerful law of the upper world, for the power of the former is effective in the underworld, not on earth, but out of the actual, which has taken away from the inner world its honour and power, has in so doing consumed its own essence. The publicly manifest spirit has the root of its power in the nether world. The self-certainty and self-assurance of a nation possesses the truth of its oath, which binds all into one, solely in the mute unconscious substance of all, in the waters of forgetfulness. Thus it is that the fulfilment of the spirit of the upper world is transformed into its opposite, and it learns that its supreme right is a supreme wrong, that its victory is rather its own downfall. The dead, whose right is denied, knows therefore how to find instruments of vengeance, which are equally effective and powerful as the power which has injured it. These powers or other communities whose altars the dogs or birds defiled with the corpse, which has not raised into unconscious universality by being given back, as is its due, to the elemental individuality, the earth, but remains above ground, in the realm of outer reality, and has now acquired, as a force of divine law, a self-conscious real universality. They rise up in hostility and destroy the community, which has dishonoured and shattered its own power, the sacred claims of the family. In this representation, the movement of human and divine law finds its necessity expressed in individuals in whom the universal appears as a pathos, and the activity of the movement appears as the action of individuals, which gives the appearance of contingency to the necessity of the activity. But individuality in action constitutes the principle of individuality as such, a principle which in its pure universality was called inner divine law. As a moment of the visible community, its activity is not confined merely to the underworld or to its outer existence, but it has an equally visible existence and movement in the actual nation. Taken in this form, what was represented as a simple movement of the individualized pathos acquires a different look, and the crime and consequent destruction of the community acquires the proper and characteristic form of their existence. Human law in its universal existence is the community. In its activity in general is the manhood of the community. In its real and effective activity is the government. It moves and maintains itself by consuming and absorbing into itself the separation of the penates, or the separation into independent families presided over by womankind, and by keeping them dissolved in the fluid continuity of its own nature. But the family is at the same time in general its element, the individual consciousness, the basis of its general activity, since the community only gets an existence through its interference with the happiness of the family, and by dissolving individual self-consciousness into the universal, it creates for itself, in what it suppresses and what is at the same time essential to it, an internal enemy, womankind in general. Womankind. The everlasting irony in the life of the community changes by intrigue the universal end of the government into a private end, transforms its universal activity into a work of some particular individual, and perverts the universal property of the state into a possession and ornament for the family. Woman in this way turns to ridicule the earnest wisdom of mature age, which, indifferent to purely private pleasures and enjoyments as well as to playing an active part, only thinks of and cares for the universal. She makes the wisdom an object of derision for raw and irresponsible youth, and unworthy of their enthusiasm. In general, she maintains that it is the power of youth that really counts. The worth of the son lies in his being the lord and master of the mother who bore him, that of the brother as being one in whom the sister finds man on a level of equality, that of the youth as being one through whom the daughter, freed from her dependence on the family, obtains the enjoyment and dignity of a wifehood. The community, however, can only maintain itself by suppressing this spirit of individualism, and because it is an essential moment, all the same creates it, and moreover, creates it by its repressive attitude towards it as a hostile principle. However, this principle, being merely evil and futile in its separation from the universal end, would be quite ineffectual if the community itself did not recognize the power of youth, the manhood which, while immature, still stands within the sphere of individuality, as the power of the whole, for the community as a nation is itself an individuality, and essentially is only such for itself by other individualities being for it, by excluding them from itself and knowing itself to be independent of them. The negative side of the community, suppressing the isolation of individuals within it, but spontaneously active in an outward direction, finds its weapons in individuality. War is the spirit and the form in which the essential moment of the ethical substance, the absolute freedom of the ethical self from every existential form, is present in its actual and authentic existence. While on the one hand, war makes the individual systems of property and personal independence, as well as the personality of the individual himself, feel the power of the negative, on the other hand, this negativity is prominent in war as that which preserves the whole. The brave youth, in whom woman finds her pleasure, the suppressed principle of corruption, now has his day, and his worth is openly acknowledged. Now it is physical strength and what appears as a matter of luck that decides on the existence of ethical life and spiritual necessity. Because the existence of ethical life rests on strength and luck, the decision is already made that its downfall has come. Just as previously only the Penates succumbed to the national spirit, so now the living spirits of the nation succumb through their own individuality and perish in a universal community, whose simple universality is soulless and dead, and is alive only in the single individual qua single. The ethical shape of spirit has vanished, and another takes its place. This ruin of the ethical substance and its passage into another form, is thus determined by the fact that the ethical consciousness is directed onto the law in a way that is essentially immediate. This determination of immediacy means that nature, as such, enters into the ethical act, the reality of which simply reveals the contradiction and the germ of destruction inherent in the beautiful harmony and tranquil equilibrium of the ethical spirit itself. For this immediacy has the contradictory meaning of being the unconscious tranquillity of nature, and also the self-conscious restless tranquillity of spirit. On account of this natural aspect, this ethical nation is, in general, an individuality determined by nature and therefore limited, and thus meets its downfall at the hands of another. But with the vanishing of this determinateness, which in the form of a real existence is a limitation, but equally the negative element in general and the self of the individuality, the life of spirit and this substance which is self-conscious in everyone is lost. The substance emerges as a formal universality in them, no longer dwelling in them as a living spirit. On the contrary, the simple compactness of their individuality has been shattered into a multitude of separate atoms.